Alright, so this is Adventures in Near, episode 21C. Woo! Strange timing. We had an A and a B, and now we have a C. Thanks to a specific young man over here, we have a twist of fate. Alright.
Uh-oh.
The shocking brace of horror had taken hold of the seafaring adventurers. Charthan Phasis' mighty and recently restored vessel, the Regal Seagull, began to sink. Gukrin slavers, proclaiming their victory in their dark, guttural tongue, loudly anticipated their newfound spoils as they swam at an alarming pace toward the to-be slaves, 24 strong, wicked sparkles in their lifeless eyes. It was only a matter of moments before they were to be boarded. Patron Dardendrian slowly loaded his prepared arrow back into its quiver. Lobelia dropped to one knee in despondency. Anya had nothing to say. All of her normal spunk dissipated. Semele de Shriagan's aged face turned sour as he accepted his fate in silence. Peregrine Clan Herodian went to raise his grandfather's hammer, but even his stoic dwarven pride had been sapped away, rendering his strength null. In a fleeting moment, he blamed only himself as if it were entirely his fault. The captain had begun shouting for his deckhands to man harpoons again in one last effort to ward off the approaching slavers, but a glance from Semele rendered him silent as well. The remaining sailors slowly approached the starboard side of the vessel, watching in silent terror as they pondered what their lives would become as slaves to the ruthless Gukrin and how long they might last. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a strange explosion happened. The first one landed nearly dead center among the slavers and the groomers still ashore, blasting them into the air and into the sand with deafening impact. Before anyone knew what was happening, or where it even came from, another blast landed, this time in the shallows between the shoreline and the Regal Seagull, right in the thick of the dozens of Gukrin bound for the vessel. The explosion hit like a mighty cannonball, deafening all around and tossing slavers in all directions. All eyes turned toward the mighty forest of Einengirth that lie to the north of the sandy shores. At that moment, a dark, familiar figure emerged from the tree line, a blackwood longbow across his back, and what appeared to be a small cannonball in one hand. Before the Gukrins could prepare arms, the small black spear was launched toward the cannons, again landing with dire accuracy, displacing the Gukrins and disorienting them further. As he drew his dark bow and readied a long black arrow bearing some foreign device on its tip, he paused just for a moment to display a broad, handsome grin that was nearly concealed by his shoulder-length dark hair. Lobelia Vikrana stood to full height, her countenance riddled by surprise and relief. "It is the Eve Runner!" she exclaimed, still uncertain as to whether or not she should be afraid or excited. Hey, you're the elf maiden.
Oh, but that's not what it sounds like.
That's exactly what that sounds like.
The Long.
Actually, lucky that
The Long, yes, that's right. It was the guy that attacked you in the docks at night to the south. The long black arrow lobbed eloquently into the mix of Gukrin assailants. With dire accuracy, it touched down on top of the base of the western cannon. With a splintering blast, the wooden structure shattered, the deadly tube plodding down into the sands of the Einengirth shores. All the sailors upon the Regal Seagull burst forth in harmonious joy. In that moment, however, the Gukrin slavers seemed to have gathered their collective senses. Those not killed or heavily wounded by the strange explosions rearming themselves. A half dozen of them began shouting and racing toward the Eve Runner, who, for whatever reason, seemed to be surprised that he was under attack despite his previous antics. With a look of shock, he hesitated but for a moment. His mind stayed his hand from his quiver, and like a bolt of lightning, off he sprinted toward the Einengirth, hotly pursued by a half dozen surprisingly quick Gukrins. Those in the water that were unaffected by the blast, though reduced in number, continued swimming at a dolphin's pace toward the Seagull, which had bottomed out and whose bow was beginning to reach for the skies.
Uh-oh.
"The Eve Runner has brought us but a moment," stated the Dragonborn Ranger solemnly. "Our situation has not much improved."
Yeah, I can do that.
His confidence somewhat restored, he drew an arrow from his quiver and drew it into the string of his father's longbow. Charthan Phasis, still bereft of his drinking stein, had begun his journey from the helm and down the ladder to the main deck, Their forces have been halved in number, he shouted, yet the vessel will soon be on the seafloor. Without a word, his first mate passed a sword to his captain. Our hopes now lie in your battle skills in the water, or, he finished, looking upward to the skies with a look of zero confidence, some miracle from on high. Sliding and stumbling about in his full plate, the hill dwarf warrior fell on his butt. A loud clank serenaded by a loud dwarven grunt. As he scrambled to right himself at the starboard edge of the vessel and drew his grandfather's cudgel, he paused. Garces, where is that red-haired time twister in all of this? As if on cue, from the quarters beneath the rising bow, Farron Soulspore emerged. Her eyes were already fully ablaze with the snow-white power of Genlai that seemed to resonate through her body at all times. She was stoic, silent, and apparently unaffected, if not fully unaware, of the companions around her. As she approached the edge of the ship, suddenly Prilana approached in very much the same fashion, as though drawn in by the eminent power. Her eyes gleamed white, and in an eldritch, unearthly unison, she joined the flowbender side by side. Prilana raised her arms high, ethereal tentacles of indigo, waving almost invisibly behind her. Farron began turning her arms, her palms flat, in a counterclockwise manner, and once again she was surrounded by translucent manifestations that appeared at her command. Intricate, highly detailed devices that looked like clocks from a time and fashion that had not yet come to pass in this world appeared, turning slowly in a clockwise fashion. As she began to speak, they started to slow and then stopped entirely, to the amazement of the companions, all of whom were watching intently, even to the point that the rapidly approaching Gukrin seemed to fade into the distance. Both Farron Soulspore and Prilana Arnoges spoke the same words as they intimated the utterances in twin fashion. Dorinis Loctus Pharodithesius Dorma! With those words, the translucent golden clocks surrounding the flowbender began to turn backwards. The adventure stood in silent awe as the impending slaver assailant slowed, then stopped, then began moving backwards as well. As the clocks turned faster, their retreat also increased in speed, and suddenly the Eve Runner could be seen running backwards out of the Einengirth. Gukrins that had been wounded or killed by the explosions came back to life, landing where they had been, and the explosions even reversed. The only beings present, unaffected, were the companions, the captain, and his mates. Then the unthinkable happened. The cannonball that had caused the final blast in the stern of the ship exited in the same direction. It had come, launching eerily back into the cannon tube from whence it came. The massive hole in the stern repaired itself instantaneously, just as the bow of the ship was coming down, and to their sudden and silent and utter shock, the Regal Seagull was upright and seaworthy once again. Still in awe, the seafaring travelers found themselves back in that final moment before the western cannon blasted its final cannonball. It was then that time stopped for just a brief moment. The white from Farron's eyes dissipated immediately, her hands dropping suddenly to her sides. She turned to the companions, and with a look on her face that might suggest she had taken a harpoon through her belly, said, "Bend not to thine own will, the natural flows." With that, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she fell limp as a fish to the wooden slats of the main deck. As her words swept past their collective ears, Lobelia fell to both knees, grasping onto her arm. Pain, that same cold, dark, terrible pain she had experienced before, flowed throughout her body. She gritted her elven teeth, grinding them as she fell to her side. All she could muster was a whisper. "Black blade." Anya Corlett froze suddenly in place. Lost in a trance, she too recollected a distant vision of a nearly forgotten memory. "Crimson moors, sea of faces." Patron looked to the skies, an unusual flash of terror over his typically adamant face. The cautionary words that the strange little gnome who had called himself Gabelli worlds away in the seaward of Waterdeep washed to the forefront of his mind, overshadowing all other thought. Summon forth not the black bird. In plain sight of all and impossible to overlook, an overwhelming winged black shadow soared overhead. There was a terrible screech that sounded much like the cry of 50 ravens in unison. The companions all cowered, kneeling and following the source of the shadow as it soared over the Regal Seagull, then turned and scooped back around, releasing another mighty screech. With that, it fluttered off high above, out of reach of any arrow or incantation, and disappeared to the north into the great forest of Einengirth. The power of Genlai quickly fading from her hands, the pale face of Prelana Arnojas went paler still. In a gasp, she looked toward the skies, and unexpectedly and horrifically, a dark smile crossed her face. With a deep, otherworldly voice, she stated plainly, "Black bird."
I don't like that bird.
Oh, why is she evil?
With that, her eyes closed, and she collapsed to the deck of the Seagull and joined Baron Soulspore in deep unconsciousness. While terrified also by the emergence of the enormous black bird that had appeared and soared to the north, the Gukrins wasted little time getting back to their battle strategy. It was obvious that, unlike the companions, they were not privy to the mysterious flow bending that Prelana and Farron had performed. In fact, they were preparing to loose their last-ditch effort to stop the Seagull from escaping to the west. The cannon was aimed and ready, and everyone on the vessel held their breath collectively, expecting the same blast into the stern of their ship. Charthan Faces, still in a state of shock, like the others, rattled himself. "Brace for cannon impact!" he shouted. In a breathless moment, lost in the panic of the moment, Lobelia looked down to the unconscious body of her dear friend Prelana. Without time to think, she grasped her arm again, and in a voice similar to the summoner's, stated plainly, "Black bird, fly." Then she fell to her knees, writhing in a silent and sudden pain. But a second before the dire cannonball soared through the air, emerging just above the tree line to the north in stupefying speed, the gigantic black bird ripped across the sands of Einengirth. The cannon fired, but a split second prior, the deafening screech of the airborne creature distracted the western cannoneer. Baron rolls 3d8.
Who the heck is Baron?
Why is this happening to me? I've been doing
Do you
good.
read the end of the chapter first, or do you read all the way through it? Let's go, Baron. 3d8.
6, 8. No.
Oh no. Oh.
Why'd you let him roll?
Here it is.
Are you kidding me?
That's impressive.
Oh, okay.
The cannon fired, but a split second prior, the deafening screech of the airborne creature distracted the western cannoneer, and the cannonball crashed into the stern, piercing the hull. It managed to only take a chunk out. The companions cheered in unison, and Charthan Faces jumped up and down, celebrating like a child whose father had returned from a war some long ways away from home. The slavers of Elendon shrieked in horror and anger, loosing arrows toward the Regal Seagull, but the distance was too great. By the mystical workings of Genlai, for good or for evil, the vessel and its passengers were safe. As Lobelia and Patron knelt to administer care to Prelana and Farron, the captain stood with an expression of complete and utter misunderstanding across his face. "I know not what happened here," he stated plainly, "but I do know that I need to fill my ale stein." He motioned to his crew, who were also attempting to snap out of their collective state of shock. "Get below the deck and begin repairs on the hull," he shouted. "The Seagull can yet be saved." He approached the companions and put one hand on Semley's shoulder and the other on Peregrine. "Gods must have a plan for you yet," he said solemnly. "Semley, please see what you can do to help these wounded. And for the love of all gods, let us find out what in the name of Allmaker happened here." He looked up to the helm where his first mate had manned his position. Set your course for a bearing of 17 degrees north. I promised these good folk that I would get them to Regal, and on the forest shores of Regal we shall see them safely. Semley, the most unaffected of all who had witnessed these events, nodded, his eyes on the unconscious women. Indeed, yet I fear that now, having seen such things as I have, a greater darkness draws near.
Is it me? What's wrong with me? Do I have to kill myself? Yeah, we should kill her. But she's the bad.
Who's the bad one? Anya's naughty, but I don't know. She's not the one that's summoning black birds.
I didn't do it. You did. Black blade. That black. Yeah, I got rid of that. I got rid of that.
You did remember?
I did.
No,
Remember?
you can still call it. It's still part of you, so it's your fault. Maybe for. Do you have like a douche or something?
That'd be quick,
painless.
We need a meat grinder.
D&D with teenagers. Tell you what.
I mean, a wood grinder would
I didn't expect a meat grinder to be part of the deal.
Are
Well, log
you saying that they
splitter.
should do?
Push over the front. Like,
I am just an observer. I just watch what goes on in the realm. I don't have a whole lot to do with fashioning things. You do that yourself.
No,
I'll test it before she
I
goes
like
and just
actually
make sure.
calling them.
okay. It's not like carrot.
No, it's a break.
We don't know a whole lot about what this bird is, but it kind of just saved the day. Kind of, right?
Yes.
Oh, why is
Right
causing
now.
so much pain?
Because you're.
I bet you will find out in a future
I
episode.
bet her eyes
Future
are gonna
episode.
turn
Why
red.
not this episode?
Oh, you know, we don't have enough time for that.
Oh.
But you successfully, despite
Good
Baron's
job.
best efforts,
That was
survived. You know, that's impressive. You remember
670.
last week, or last game session, you needed a 22 or less. A 22 or less out of 24, 3d8 roll.
Got a 23.
And you rolled a 23. You rolled a 22 this time. Or 21. It was less than 22, but I couldn't believe that. So, but now fates have changed, and we will see what happens next.
Okay.
So we're done?
Yes.